Let me welcome you all this evening. My name is Beavis Longstreth, and I've been a trustee of the New Schools for 28 years. I think I'm getting to be the oldest trustee around. My activities for the New School, in addition to serving on the Milano Board of Advisors, has mainly been as chair of the Audit and Risk Committee and very involved with our investment committee. So welcome to this program. It's a wonderful program. I wish I could tell you that Citizens United had been repealed and we wouldn't need this program, but it has not been repealed, nor will it be probably for 50 years. So welcome to the Anatomy of Campaign Finance, Money's Powerful Influence on U.S. Politics and Policy. And today is the annual Nathan Levin Lecture, featuring, as you can see, Jacob Hacker, Jeff Smith, and Joe Hagan. It's a terrific team to wrestle with this important issue. These lectures on public policy were endowed by the Levin family in 1989 in honor of Nathan Levin, who in private life was an industrialist and an entrepreneur and financier, but he was also involved with the New School for more than 40 years as one of its trustees. Early in his career, he worked closely with Julius Rosenwald, who was the longtime president of Sears Roebuck when Sears Roebuck was a great institution. We probably, if you're old enough, you've seen catalogs. The two of them together provided seed money for the construction of thousands of schools for African Americans in the South in an effort to counteract the devastating effects of segregation. Later, Mr. Levin became president of the Reporter magazine, a rather liberal publication in those days, and chairman of Pantheon Books. He served on the board of directors of the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Hall of Science, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and the Scientific American. He joined the New School Board in 1942. He served until his death in 1988 at the age of 84. He was chairman of the board for 3 years, 61 to 63, and he actually served as president for 1 year. He was one of a number of local civil leaders affiliated with the New School who in the early 60s sought to promote the university's role in reform politics and community service. And this vision of Mr. Levin and his colleagues ultimately led to the founding of the Center for New York City Affairs. The center began offering courses to help New Yorkers understand how to shape government policy. And those courses eventually became the Graduate School of Management and Urban Policy, which was a forerunner of what is now the Milano School. In fact, this year is the 40th anniversary of the Urban Policy and Management program that grew out of the center, enrolling its first master's degree class in 1971. Today, a Milano education with its singular combination of policy and practice, and that's practice in the world's leading city, which it uses as its laboratory, prepares our alumni to be especially effective in addressing urban policy issues. Our students include current and future policymakers, nonprofit leaders, labor and community activists, legislative staffers, and private sector executives. I know that Nathan Levin would be proud to see the urban program today and the important work of the Center for the New York City Affairs, which continues to flourish as a core program of Milano. We're thrilled to have Jacob Hacker and Joe Hagan here with us for this discussion. And to introduce them, I'd like to welcome Jeff Smith, Assistant Professor of Politics and Advocacy at Milano, and recently a star on NPR's This American Life. If you haven't seen it, go to the web and pick it out. Thank you.
Well, as anyone who happened to hear it knows, Beavis is using the word star very liberally there. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's an honor to be here. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge just a couple people. First, Andrew White, who's the director of the Center for New York City Affairs, which has sponsored tonight's event. Thank you, Andrew. And also, given that it is the 40th anniversary of the Urban Policy Analysis Program, our program chair, Alex Schwartz, is here. So just thanks for being here. The New School's graduate program in urban policy analysis was founded, of course, in 1971 in response to the multifaceted crisis that was then facing New York City and other cities. And its mission was really to train committed young people, idealistic young people, to address all of these problems facing urban America. The program is among the first of its kind in the United States, and throughout its history, it's been known for combining experiential and critical perspectives. At the heart of the curriculum are client-centered courses in which students address policy and management problems for New York City agencies and area nonprofits. Furthermore, while the program prepares students to succeed in a wide range of careers, it does so by teaching students to question the orthodox ways of understanding and addressing urban issues. Money in politics, which is the topic of tonight's discussion, is a subject that's central to the urban policy program. It's a key concern of our specialization in politics and advocacy, and it was also a subject for one of the program's client-based courses, in which a group of students advised a member of New York City City Council on ways of improving and safeguarding the city's campaign finance system in the wake of Citizens United, and also hoping to make that system spread at the state level, which, as those of you who've been reading the headlines the last couple weeks know, a public campaign financing bill has just been sponsored by the Assembly Speaker, Sheldon Silver, which is based largely upon New York City's system. And that was very close to the recommendation given by the students. So it's wonderful to see some of their policies really be put into action. Tonight's discussion with Jacob Hacker and Joe Hagan couldn't come at a more timely or fitting moment to launch the Urban Policy Program series of 40th anniversary events. So, that said, first I'd like to introduce Professor Jacob Hacker. He is the director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, the Stanley B. Reser Professor of Political Science, and Senior Research Fellow in International and Area Studies at the Macmillan Center at Yale University. Professor Hacker is an expert on the politics of U.S. health and social policy and is the author of a recent book called Winner-Take-All Politics: How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class, with Paul Pierson. He is also the author of The Great Risk Shift: The New Economic Insecurity and the Decline of the American Dream, The Divided Welfare State, The Battle Over Public and Private Social Benefits in the United States, and The Road to Nowhere: The Genesis of President Clinton's Plan for Health Security, which was the co-winner of the Brownlow Book Award of the National Academy of Public Administration. He is also co-author with Paul Pierson of Off Center, The Republican Revolution and the Erosion of American Democracy, and has edited 2 volumes, most recently, Health at Risk: America's Ailing Health System and How to Heal It. And I am as confused as you are right now about how someone that age could have written this many books, but I could tell you about his scholarly articles and the places he's published, but we only have until 8 o'clock, and so I'll leave that alone. But I will just note that Professor Hacker received his BA from Harvard in 1994, his PhD from Yale in 2000, has had a tremendously productive decade. It's an honor to be here with someone who takes the role of being a public intellectual so seriously, so widely published, but also someone who has testified before Congress, someone who has advised leading politicians, who consistently writes for popular publications, and someone who is the author of the 2001 proposal for universal health care, which really became the template for the health care proposals of several of the Democratic nominees in the 2008 presidential election. Without further ado, Jacob Hacker.
Thanks.
You know, after introductions like that, I always think that whatever I say is going to be a disappointment. So, but I do want to thank you for having me. I want to praise the urban policy program. Like it, I was founded in 1971, and it was a good year, I guess. And I also wanted to thank you, Jeff, for organizing this, and Joe, you for joining me in this discussion. I agree, it is a very important day to discuss these issues. Jeff was kind not to mention that I actually wasn't able to come to the first date we'd agreed upon, so I insisted that we reschedule it for May Day. You know, I just felt that was really the appropriate thing. So Jeff has told me that I should speak for about 15 minutes, and whatever I'm in that position, I am reminded of an evaluation that I received when I was just beginning as an assistant professor at Yale. It began quite promisingly. It began, Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it in your class. Because that way it would seem like an hour. Okay. So I hope the next 15 minutes actually seems like 15 minutes. I have one more thanks to offer, and that's to my co-author, Paul Pearson. It's really, truly been a collaborative venture, going back to our 2005 book, Off Center, which argued that the Republicans had moved much farther to the right than the Democrats had moved to the left. I think subsequent events have borne that out, although the 2006 election sort of ran against the thesis we had offered that they had not only done that, but had managed to do it without paying the electoral price. But I think it's worth, one of the things I'm going to talk about today is just how asymmetric the effects of money have been on the two parties. Because even though Democrats have managed to gain a competitive position relative to Republicans, they've done so in many ways by abandoning some of the core constituencies and goals that they once held, or at least a significant non-trivial portion of the party has done so. And Paul and I, in writing Winner Take All Politics, and this came out, by the way, in 2010, well before the Occupy Wall Street protests began, or the debt ceiling debacle made it clear just how polarized the parties were about issues of economic inequality. In fact, we were asked to appear on Bill Moyer's new program, and there was so the first of this program, which it's been a great series, was on the book, and for one brief shining moment, we managed to break into the bottom ranks of the paperback bestseller list of the New York Times. When I called my publisher and said, hey, this is great, we're number 26 or something, he says, now you are a New York Times bestselling author, and you will always be a New York Times bestselling author. So I think I got it cheaply, and I really appreciate it. So there's no question that money in politics is nothing new. McKinley's fixer, Mark Hanna, famously said there are two things that matter in politics. The first is money. I can't remember the second. Today's political fixer, Rahm Emanuel, I think put it better. He said there are three parts of a campaign. The first part is money, money, money. The second part is money, money, press. And the third part is money, press, and votes. And for those of you keeping score, that's money 6, votes 1. So there's no question that money has always been part of American politics, has become a much more important part. And what I want to try to do, because Joe is much more of an expert on recent developments in the world of campaign finance, is talk about the big picture in which that's happened. Because there's basically three broad transformations that have occurred that I think have simultaneously propelled money to the forefront, have made it such a central part of our politics today, and in turn have really shaped the influence of money, what money has done. Because I think there's a standard view among political scientists that the role of money is fairly limited. And that's because I think there's a very narrow view of the role of money in politics. So the tendency is to focus on campaign spending and note that, look, in most competitive elections, right, both parties or both candidates can come up with enough money to run a reasonable campaign. And I think that just really ignores some of the profound effects of money that occur despite the fact that you have both parties investing heavily in raising it. And let me just mention three that are going to be the focus of my discussion. First of all, as money becomes more important, those who have money become more important in American politics. And we have seen a massive hyper-concentration of income at the very top. The scale is enormous. It's almost hard to fathom. One way to put it is that over the 2000s economic expansion, such as it was, about 53% of all after-tax, after-government benefit income gains, 53% after taxes, after benefits, went to the richest 1% of Americans. During the most recent recovery, such as it is, about 93% of pre-tax income gains have gone to the richest 1%. And it's not just the top 1%, it's really the top 1/10 of 1%, the top 100th of 1%. As the gap between the middle and the very top has grown, so too has the political influence of the very top relative to the middle. Political scientists have found increasing evidence of this. It's pretty obvious why it is when you think about it. Everyone who is an engaged citizen can vote, but not everyone can donate huge amounts of money to campaigns. And of course, given trends that we've seen in American democracy over the last generation, not everyone really has a reliable access to the vote as well. The second thing that money does is it changes the relationship between politicians and those in the top ranks of the economy. The distance between Wall Street offices or CEO boardrooms and Washington salaries has become so great that there's a gravitational pull that is much, much, much stronger. So one of the things that we tend not to talk about when we talk about campaign finance is the revolving door. But that door revolves much more quickly than it used to, and it revolves between two very, very distinct worlds. And the pull of that money can affect politicians of both parties. A third way that money matters, and I think this is also important, is that money has an enormous distortionary effect on what politicians spend their time doing. Now, there's the most obvious way that's the case, right? Politicians today mostly fundraise. That is a great part of their daily activities. And I don't know about you, but dialing for dollars does not strike me as the primary reason why I sent my elected representative to Congress or my elected president to the White House. Second of all, there's a distortionary effect on the agenda more broadly, and I think this is far more fundamental. We focus so much on the individual level corruption. Did Congressman X do this for interest Y? That we don't focus as much on the way in which money distorts what issues get a hearing at all. What is that members of Congress spend their time doing? Now, I think one of the important things to understand here is that the rise of the winner-take-all economy, as my co-author Paul Pearson and I call it, did not occur in isolation from what government did. It is true, as you probably know, that most of this change occurred in the market in the sense that people at the very top started earning much more. In the top 1/10 of 1%, for example, that group, about 60% of that group is corporate and financial executives, right? And their pay and their capital gains went way, way up over this period. And that is the fundamental force driving the winner-take-all economy. So clearly this was just a market story. These are, you might think, the superstars of the new global economy. They're the ones who are benefiting from this new enlarged market that allows the most talented to reap the rewards. And government has mostly, in this view, been sort of playing an after-the-fact role. Now, you might grant that role is to mostly pile on, give them some more tax cuts, maybe free up the market a little bit for them, but this view tends to see this as really about the private market and how it's changed. And this view is completely wrong. It's wrong in two respects. First, the market is not somehow abstracted or distinct from what government does. The way in which the winner-take-all economy has unfolded has been deeply shaped by what government did to free up corporations from the meddling influence of labor unions, to deregulate the financial markets, to allow some people to reap huge rewards while imposing risks on the rest of us, and in addition, to free corporate CEOs from the many of the kinds of stakeholders that once were pressed on them to try to restrain some of the excesses in the boardroom. So what we've seen is the creation of a model where those at the very top have much more scope to set their own pay with much less pushback from broader forces, whether citizens groups, whether labor unions, whether regulatory agencies. Now, of course, the pendulum has swung back recently, but if we try to understand the rise of the winner-take-all economy, it is absolutely essential to understand that government was there from the beginning, from the creation. And it was there putting its finger on the scale in favor of those who are winning. And this is no accident. So the third thing I really want to drive home is that a lot of these policy changes took place either through sort of beneath the radar screen adjustments of policies about which most of us know little and care less, such as rules governing corporate governance or financial regulations, or they've taken place through what my co-author and I call drift. That is the failure to update policies to reflect changing circumstances. So if you think about the shifting role of labor unions in an increasingly global economy, or the way in which financial innovation has changed the challenge of regulation, a dynamic democratic government needs to be responsive to those changes. And one of the things that money has done most effectively, and those wielding it, is to gum up the works of government to make it hard for it to address these challenges. So again, if we focus too much on the very visible, very sometimes egregious manifestations of money's influence, we may miss some of these more subtle ones, and we may miss the full transformation that's taken place. So I want to conclude with a couple observations on where this leaves us. And I know this hasn't been the most, I don't know, optimistic or inspiring recounting of what's happened to our democracy over the last generation. So I want to say first that I do think that there is cause for optimism in this diagnosis. Why? Because if this is not the result of kind of inexorable forces that are beyond the control of domestic public policy, beyond the control of our politicians, our democratic officials, then at least we have in our hands the ability to change things. And I do think that there are a few changes that would be more powerful in reversing this trend than really trying to free Congress and the White House from the grip, and and the Supreme Court, though here I think the story is a little different, from the grip of money. Second, and finally, I think that as we think about the role of money, I mentioned this before, we really have to understand just how different the effects have been on the two parties. And that's where I want to close. Because I think there's a tendency in commentary about American politics today, particularly on the part of journalists who are afraid that they'll be seen as partisan, to say, look what's happening. We have liberals running to the left, responding to Emily's List and Hollywood money and George Soros, and we have conservatives running to the right, responding to the Koch brothers and to Club for Growth and Grover Norquist. It's symmetrical. It's the same thing, a pox on both their houses. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. I can show you evidence that the Republicans have moved dramatically much more to the right than the Democrats have moved to the left, but you really don't need it, right? This is one of those cases, what we call in political science, it meets the grandmother test, right? Your grandmother knows this is true, right? And I think it's really, really destructive that as we talk about these trends, we fail to note this. In particular, we fail to note first that on the Republican side, right, this shift has been progressive and ongoing, and on the House side, it has meant that the Republican caucus on the House is advancing policy ideas on the economy that are really as far to the right as we have seen at any point since the battle over Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The second thing that we miss, I think, in this is what I was talking about before, that money is not neutral in its effects. It's not neutral in the sense that the Republican Party has been emboldened by money, particularly now that Wall Street has shifted its allegiance to the Republican Party. It sees no reason to compromise, not just because its base says do not compromise, do not back down, that is a sign of weakness, but also because the money that's going into the party is in support exactly of what Republicans want to do, right? On the Democratic side, the story is different, right? Money cross-pressures Democrats, right? It creates tensions within the party. It creates tensions within individual figures, right? Drawn to Wall Street and its allure, right, on the one hand, but seeking financial reform on the other hand. What is a good Democrat to do? Well, Sometimes the best response to those kind of dilemmas is to do nothing, right? But we cannot do nothing if we're going to address the problems we face. Drift in the face of the destruction of our democracy under this tide of money is essentially losing the republic. And this is the challenge we face today. Thank you.
Jacob, first of all, that was spectacular. Second of all, I think you have my introduction to Joe under there somewhere.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry about
There
that.
might be a couple more.
Yeah, here. Sorry.
There we go.
You want my twin?
Well, gosh, so much food for thought, and so much that I want to delve into in a bit here. But before we do that, we are going to have the privilege of, now that we have gotten the big picture laid out so nicely, we are going to go from macro to micro and learn from Joe Hagan a little bit more about some of basically the breakdown of the campaign finance system in this country. Joe Hagan is a contributing editor at New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, and Men's Journal. He began at New York Magazine in 2006 after working as a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where he was part of the team that covered the Valerie Plame CIA leak case. Previously, as a columnist for the New York Observer, he broke a series of stories on Dan Rather's travails at CBS News, and before that worked as an online financial and media reporter. Joe's investigations have taken him inside institutions as various as Goldman Sachs, the New York Times, Twitter, and of course the world of political action committees. And he has profiled such figures as Henry Kissinger, Karl Rove, John McCain, and Liz Cheney. His latest story in Texas Monthly magazine explores the secret history of George W. Bush's National Guard service and how it brought down CBS legend Dan Rather. He's here tonight because of his wonderful expose on the rise of super PACs and the role of opposition research in providing material for those super PACs to use. It was in New York Magazine recently and is called The Coming Tsunami of Slime. And to say that he was prescient would be the understatement of the year. Joe Hagan, thank you.
I'm really delighted to be here. Ink-stained wretches do not get invited into academia hallowed halls that often, so this is my first time speaking in this context, so I'm delighted about that. I thought I'd start by just telling you a little story about a young political consultant in the 1980s who was in a state that was sort of poised between Republican and Democratic power. It was in Democratic power, but barely. And this political consultant was a Republican looking for a way to bring his party back into power. And he knew that backing, one race or another for the Republican Party was not going to do the trick. He really needed to have a bigger vision, and that bigger vision was going to have to do with money. And so this political consultant started a political action committee that was focused on tort reform. And he realized there were many industries that were trying to fight lawsuits. And so he went to the construction business, he went to the pharmaceutical business, and he went to the tobacco industry, and was managed to put together millions of dollars for this group that he would run and be able to funnel this money to a whole bunch of races around this state. So of course I'm talking about Karl Rove. And this was the beginning of Karl Rove's the architect, and part of his entire concept was, how can I get a gigantic Rolodex of millionaires and use that in a laser-like way to change the law, to get people elected, to put Republicans in power. So that story hasn't ended. It continues to this day, and it has affected history. We've seen it. 8 years of Bush, and I'll tell you, there were two major businessmen that he came into contact with in the 80s during this time when he had this tort reform pack. Harold Simmons, a leveraged buyout artist, businessman, and Bob Perry, a construction magnate, millionaire, maybe a billionaire. Both these men later, flash forward to 2004, were bankrolled the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth that attacked John Kerry in 2004. And, may have changed that election in doing so. Flash forward to after Barack Obama is elected, and we get the Citizens United ruling, and a huge light bulb goes off in Karl Rove's head because he sees an opportunity here to take what he's been doing since the 1980s and supersize it, take it to the next level. And he starts American Crossroads. This is the super PAC that is really the center, or at least parallel with the Koch brothers, of the conservative political action committees and super PACs that we're seeing. So I wrote a profile of Karl Rove and a couple of last year, kind of about how he came to do all of this. And it wasn't even just that he got the same Rolodex of millionaires to fill the coffers of this super PAC. He also realized that he could take all of the other super PACs and be the sort of hub in the middle of all of them all. So he invites them all over to his house. He dubs it the Weaver Terrace Group because this is where his street is and his apartment is. He's a man who really sees himself as an epic player in history, so he's always naming things after his house or whatever. By the way, I have a picture, and I'll show it to anybody who asks me I took in his apartment of his baby shoes, which he has sitting right next to a little model of the Air Force One. So he's got this, this is his vision of himself in the world. And he basically, now they are coordinating. All these super PACs are coordinating. They are, listen, I'm going to spend all my money on X, Y, and Z races, and you spend yours on here so that we don't overlap. And it's all of a piece. And so the impact of that, so that is just to sort of by way to say that, yes, this has been going on a long time, but now we're at a new place. This election is like a case study for this money in politics theme, because we've never seen this much money. And so 3 points I'll make. One is in my own reporting, in my job as a reporter, I'm being always lowered into these dark, horrible places like Goldman Sachs or Karl Rove's apartment or the political action committees. And the one thing I sort of took away from going into this world and kind of trying to figure out what was going to happen was that there's what I call a presidential election industrial complex. There's an industry that is there to receive all of this money and spend it. And the point is destruction. It is the point. They say this to me. I just yesterday talked to the head of American Crossroads because I thought I would do a little R&D before I came here. And they say, well, we're only going to do negative ads. I mean, that's all we want to do. That's all we can do. That's our job. He said, we tried one positive ad, and we got an FEC complaint because people thought we were coordinating with the campaign. So we just said, we're never doing that again. So the point of these is to be negative. But also this industry is like a fraternity of consultants. It's a consultant class who has convinced these fundraisers, the money people, and the politicians that they are the tool that you need to win. And when you think about reform and change, this is almost like a built-in lobby to resist that, because these guys are getting paid huge amounts of money. And now there's more money and there's more of them. And so that is kind of, and by the way, it's, talk about the 1% or the elite. These are the same people, over every election cycle. There's very little turnover here. There's like these gurus that all these politicians are convinced they need. And so, that's one point I'll make. I think that it's, now that this spigot is running really high, these people become more powerful. There's the whole phenomenon of the outside group and now in these super PACs, it's they, you know, as I described in my story, they are set up to be negative. And you know, one thing that he's right about, I think that's a good point, is that this is a phenomenon that is largely from the right. And they are setting it up so that, in this case, Mitt Romney does not have to go negative. They have a whole negative thing, and he can pretend that he's at an arm's length from it and try to send out his positive message, whatever that will be, and let these guys do all the dirty work and pretend that there's no you know, crossover. Maybe you guys, there was a great New York Times story a few weeks ago that showed just how ridiculous all of this is, because the same consultants who are serving Romney's campaign are also doing all the work for the super PAC supporting him. And they say, oh, we have a little Chinese wall inside that these guys don't talk to each other. You know, one's a husband and wife. Yeah, they don't talk, right? So about with their business at all. So it's completely ridiculous. But the third thing I will say, though, just to throw a little controversy into all of this, I don't know how many of you saw what Eliot Spitzer has said about all of this, but he did say something really kind of fascinating about this, which is that he believes that Citizens United case was actually a proper vote. He thought that that was actually the right thing to do, that you have to, because if you say no, that these corporations and unions cannot pay money to create messages in the free press or on TV and buy messages, that you're limiting free speech. He said, I want to just quote him, he said, you never defeat speech by limiting speech. He said that's the First Amendment principle that he lives by, and he thinks that we'll be a healthier democracy for it. So that's a pretty provocative thing to say, and he's no tool of the right. So, you know, discuss. You know, that's part of what I think we're here to do, is try to figure out, like, and I would say, let's just look at the primary that we just saw. It was wild and hilarious and ridiculous. But it did, you know, in its own twisted, weird way, foment all kinds of interesting discussion. I mean, if Newt Gingrich hadn't attacked Romney over Bain, how much would we know about Bain? You know, if the Times hadn't had to correct all the facts in his documentary, we might not know what the facts are. So there is maybe a case to be made that, you know, and I'm not saying the means justify the ends, but maybe that's something we can talk about. And whether or not, you know, we're in the Wild West stage of this because this law was just passed, but maybe there'll be reforms and maybe somehow we can, you know, put, you know, have greater transparency and improve the way it's functioning. But do we need to ban these kind of contributions outright? That's a question. So, and so I'll just leave it at that question mark, and we can kind of get into a discussion, right? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Well, that was excellent. So I was really glad that you began with the example of Karl Rove, and in particular on the issue of tort reform. It ties in so well with some of Jacob's earlier work. You know, Jacob has written about the ways that politics drives policy, which drive politics. And the way you described that, you know, you talked about how a few things happen from Karl Rove's perspective. Republicans, if you win, you know, Republicans gain power. You make a lot of money as a consultant. But you know, one of the things that I'm sorry, go ahead.
And he did change. The Supreme Court in Texas passed reforms,
and the Supreme Court
to
passes
help
a law.
Bob Perry's business considerably. So.
And once that business is helped considerably, it does a couple things. First of all, Bob Perry has more money to give for these causes to make consultants more money. And the other ancillary benefit, I guess, from that perspective, is that trial lawyers, one of really the three legs of the stool for Democratic fundraising nationally, can no longer make the money they once made. So in addition to making your own party more, you're really defunding the other party, you know, the other party's financial base at the same time. Jacob, you've written kind of about these patterns in some of your earlier work. Do you want to, you know, comment on that?
Well, I'd like to, and I just, in keeping with Carl Rowe's tradition, I'd like to claim the hacker microphone here and say a few words. So that was really interesting, thanks. I particularly was, I thought it was particularly interesting to see the extent to which this is reflective of kind of long-term development within the Republican Party, and Rove's pivotal role in that. I mean, in the book that I was mentioning earlier, Off Center, we talked about this idea of power brokers, you know, people who don't actually have that much formal power, but they sit at sort of the center of networks where they're able to coordinate activity. And that matters an enormous amount in the contemporary political universe. And it probably has always mattered a huge amount in American politics because we have such a fragmented political system, right? So to make things happen, the hacker microphone is acting up, to make things happen across the various, you know, branches of American government, to make things happen across the states. Look at what ALEC has done, the Koch-funded American Legislative Exchange Council, requires coordinated action. And parties that are more coordinated than their opponents tend to be able to do much, much more. Relative power matters enormously. It's sort of like that old story about the two guys who see a bear in the distance, and the one guy starts putting on his running shoes, and the other guy says, "Why are you putting on your running shoes? You can't outrun a bear." And the guy says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you." So the Republican Party has, generally speaking, had the running shoes on, and the money helps a lot. On this question of sort of the vicious cycle of money and lobbying begetting, you know, favorable policy, which in turn enriches the narrow interests that are then doing more lobbying, I think you don't have to look much farther than American tax policy to really see that at work. I think tax policy is a great example because at one level it's so transparent, right? I mean, you know, how much you pay in taxes is a known amount. There's a code that's supposed to determine what you pay. But actually it turns out, if you start to look at the American tax code, it is just rife with special favors. And it's not just the big ones that we all know about, but an enormous amount of small and not so small provisions that no one but the affected interests know anything about. And two that I think are really great because they have no other rationale besides the fact that there is a very powerful lobbying group that is fighting for them and nobody else really understands them or can persistently organize to defeat them, are the carried interest provision. For those who don't know, this is what allows people in the private equity world, including Mitt Romney, to pay capital gains tax rate, the capital gains tax rate on much of their essentially earned labor income, because it basically allows them to treat profits of assets under management as if they were their own money that they were investing. That's the non-technical definition. Okay, almost everyone who looks at this, conservative economists to flaming liberals, has said this is a pretty egregious provision. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It violates a lot of features of the tax code. But it turns out that not only has it not been overturned, but it's actually survived despite the fact that Democrats ran against it in 2000, ran saying they would change it in both 2006 and 2008. And lo and behold, it still exists. If one looks behind the scenes, the senator from New York, Chuck Schumer, has played a very influential role in keeping it off the table, saying, "Oh, absolutely, at some point we really do have to fix this. We got to make sure we do it in a fair way, and maybe we'll do it in a fair way 2, 3, maybe 300 years from now." So that's just one example. I had another, but I'll just hold off there. Just say that in tax policy, you see it but in an enormous range of areas because the financial ramifications are so great. And I think political scientists who look at this are perplexed, right? And because now that we've started to look more at lobbying rather than just campaign finance, the potential returns are so large, and the investments, frankly, are pretty small. So there's $4 billion in official lobbying spending. There's probably more than that that's unofficial, and this is just at the federal level. But the returns are mind-boggling for the amount that these firms put in. And I think one of the reasons why that is, right? So how can that be? Is that a lot of these areas there isn't a whole lot of competition. And so I come back to the final sort of theme that I was talking about before. I mean, the asymmetric quality of American politics today. Those who have ample financial resources they can devote to lobbying, right? Sometimes they're competing with each other, right? Google goes head-to-head with the Motion Picture Association of America and kicks its butt, as it turns out. But a lot of times, right, companies can work in a world of mutual non-interference, and the question is there going to be a counterweight, a countervailing power? And where would that come from? Well, it could come from one of three places. It could come from the Democratic Party. That's an elite source of resistance. It could come from unions, and it could come from citizens groups, broad-based citizens groups. And I would say on economic issues, all three sources of countervailing power have basically failed. The Democrats, for reasons that I've already discussed, unions because, frankly, they're just holding on for their life, and citizens groups because we've really seen an erosion of kind of broad-based groups outside of what are sometimes called post-materialist issues, right? Issues of identity and civil rights and justice that are very, very important. But on bread and butter pocketbook issues, there aren't a lot of these groups. So to my mind, that really is what makes that vicious cycle you were talking about possible.
And really, that third group that you mentioned is the last leg of the Democratic fundraising stool that really exists, given so many Republican policies that have contributed to the annihilation, really, of unions in the country.
Well, I mean, I'd just say the numbers on this are really striking, right? So we used to think of, and you go back, to the 70s, even then, you thought of business and labor as sort of being groups at rough parity or close to parity in their spending. That wasn't true then, but they were in the same ballpark. It's no longer the case, and the labor unions cannot continue to spend at the level that they're spending. Really, it's not possible to do the organizing that's necessary and at the same time try to maintain the kind of investment in politics. Was a Chamber of Commerce, for example, raising money, the amount of money that a few years ago no single party was raising.
Man, when we get to the audience Q&A, you're going to be the first person in line. So, we're talking a little bit about the asymmetric. You used the word asymmetric effects of money. Nick Confessor with the New York Times, who's been, kind of on this beat recently, but has been covering the intersection of money and politics for a decade now at various places. He wrote in a Washington Monthly piece called Welcome to the Machine about a decade ago that lobbyists, K Street for 40 years when Democrats ran the House and Senate, K Street gave to Democrats because they had to and gave to Republicans because they wanted to. Do you either of you see a formula for how Democrats might begin to change that, or how the growth of sort of new industries like the technology industry might become industries that are aligned with Democrats in the way that the energy industry, for example, and natural resource extraction is overwhelmingly favors Republicans? Joe, what do you think?
You mean how can they get some money too?
Basically, yes.
That's a good question. If I had an answer, I would maybe try to help them out, but I don't. But I think that, the problem, I was thinking about the energy thing. It would seem to be, a possible route, but even that is already like having sort of the legs cut out from under it because of the fracking thing. I mean, already you're seeing in the energy sector like a slowdown of the the move towards. I'm sorry to be negative and not come up with a silver bullet for you, but I want to be realistic for a second. Is that because they can't, they're starting to see as a pure investment that it's going to be delayed. So that may not actually be the way. The fundraising from individuals that took place in 2008, I don't know if that's going to happen again, but they made a very powerful case for that being a way forward. I don't know, if that is only built around the kind of excitement that you had in 2008 and the momentum that he had, but I'm afraid I can't answer that question for you. I would like to be able to, but I don't know.
Jacob, any thoughts?
Well, I think that certainly in 2008 there was a hope that the broad-based contributions made possible by the internet would be a counterweight, and certainly President Obama as candidate was able to very effectively use that. But I agree with Joe that that's not both the amount of money coming in from other sources and the enthusiasm about the Obama presidency, i.e. the increase in the former and the waning of the latter among those who might give small donations have made it much more difficult. And I think it was an admission of that President Obama basically said, oh, you know, I need a super PAC too.
Which is not done well. And, you know, I mean, they raised maybe like, you know, less than $10 million.
Six.
Okay, $6 million against, you know, Karl Rove's
$300 million.
$300 million. So
the president will personally raise enough money to run a competitive campaign. I think this goes back to something that here's where I think the sort of political science conventional wisdom is accurate, and that is that at the level of high profile, say open seat or presidential elections, you can get to rough parity. And one of the ways one of the things that they miss is the Democrats got to rough parity in part by catering to a lot of these same interests. The deregulation push was partly driven by a kind of, you know, belief in the ability of financial innovation to eliminate systemic risk that was not universally shared by any means, but was broadly shared and shared by Democrats as well as Republicans. But it was also just driven by the fact there was so much money pushing in that direction, and Democrats were taking a lot of it. They were, if you look at the top 5 recipients in the Senate of Wall Street funds before the 2008 election, 4 of them were Democrats. I won't name them, but I think you guys could probably come up with them. 2 of them were representing the state. So I would say one other thing, which a potential, so there are 2 other responses, right? One is to try to change the game, right? So is there a way in which you can have shifting away from, so you're not going to deal with lobbying this way, you're not going to deal with some of the other distortions that I've talked about, but on the campaign finance front, are there reforms that will work? I'm sure we'll talk more about that. The problem, of course, at this point is that not only the hurdle at one point in time was the Senate filibuster, which was 60 votes. Now, of course, it's this constitutional amendment threshold, which is even higher, not to mention you have to get the states on board as well. The second direction to go, and this may be where Democrats go, is to cultivate your own set of rich people. And I did feel a bit, I don't know if you felt this way, Joe, but during the campaign that it was almost like adopt a politician month, right? You know, so which billionaire will pick which Republican candidate to be their puppet.
And following your theme, Joe, you know, which one, you know, will travel with the candidate for 3 weeks straight on the road, and then both with the straight face look at reporters and say, no, we don't talk about that $20 million contribution. We've never discussed the super PAC.
So there are a lot of rich Democrats. I mean, there are certainly enough, and to be able to do this. But again, it's how I feel, and it's the same way I feel about the idea that, oh well, if we could, you know, philanthropy will replace government, right? You know, that basically the idea that we're going to have this sort of the benefactors of the new Gilded Age being able to sort of help us out of our democratic dilemma is, let's just say, a little bit like having the foxes guard the hen house.
So, you know,
I just want to, can I make a couple of points? One is that just in this election, everybody's sort of, you know, you look at those numbers on the right and whoa, and then on the left with the super PAC anyway, not so much. Obama will raise an enormous amount of money, and the reason that they got so scared on the right and created all these things was because they were terrified they were going to get outgunned by Obama. Another thing is that it takes a lot more money to unseat an incumbent. The thing is, like, if you do polls, and they have done these polls, you know, people know a lot about Barack Obama. To change people's perception of him requires a lot of money. To, like, you know, they have formulas for how much money it takes to change the needle. Mitt Romney is like a blank slate for most people. So it's just all them changing. They can, you know, create his image for him if they get out ahead of him, and he's already had some of it created. So, you know, it's not exactly equal. So if you're sitting there in a state of terror, you shouldn't be necessarily. But, well, yes, what did you want to ask?
Oh, you talked about him creating an image hopefully he won't be able to shake it and have it etch-a-sketched out.
Exactly, right. Well,
but the Democrats actually, have made attempts in past cycles to cultivate a sort of coterie of super donors in the same way Republicans have successfully. The Democracy Alliance group that I think Matt Bai has written extensively about. Why have those why have those attempts kind of waned? Which I know in 2004 there was so much energy and enthusiasm and money given by these hugely wealthy Democratic philanthropists. What's happened to that group, and why aren't we hearing about them?
From what I understand, the enthusiasm about Obama has gone down. I think that they are worried. I mean, you want your money to, these guys think this way. It's like it's an investment, and am I confident that I'm going to get some sort of return on this investment? And it may show a lack of confidence, or they're holding out, waiting to see how this thing develops. A lot of this money ends up coming in at, the 11th hour, you'll find,
Sure.
you know what I mean? I think because of all the questions you're talking about who, we know that you discussed how a lot of the money went from Wall Street, shifted columns there. Well, he's alienated some of that, and he's on this very precarious line between needing that money and having this trying to dip into the populist rhetoric and kind of, but at the same time on the right, they're saying you're a socialist if you start to go that direction. He's in a very, it's a tightrope that he's walking, and I think that that's impacting on some level the enthusiasm from the donor base.
Absolutely. So let me ask this question. You talked about game changing, how can the game be changed? And you were talking about it both first from a campaign finance perspective. Let me go from a little different perspective and ask, how can some of is there any way to change the incentives that have so driven up the salaries on Wall Street? I think Paul Volcker has said that we, by distorting, by the fact that salaries are so distorted, we've driven the smartest people in the country who used to want to be engineers now want to be financial engineers. And the consequences were we have a crappy Wall Street and we have crappy bridges. What, if anything, can be done to begin changing some of the incentives in the market? Is there anything?
Well, I believe there is, but if my diagnosis is correct, a lot of that's going to have to come through political change. So we'll get to that in a moment. I'm glad you quoted Volcker, because my favorite line from him was when he said that the last great financial innovation was the ATM. So there are two groups I talked about. That is corporate executives and financial executives, and I think it's about a 2-to-1 ratio among the top 1/10 of 1%. So the CEOs are actually, or people in the top ranks of corporate America are actually a larger portion, but the really big money is on the financial side. So let's start with the most simple point, which is that at the very least, the effective tax rates on these earners should be roughly what, somewhere near where they were before those earners became so much massively richer. Now, right now we're having a debate over returning to the Clinton era tax rates that crushed the financial economy so terribly. And if you look at just the tax cuts since the mid-90s, they've been worth enormous amounts. So let me just give you, I think, more or less accurate numbers based on memory. So in 1995, the top 400 taxpayers, so the richest 400 taxpayers, paid an average effective individual tax rate of around 30%. And in 2007, after the Bush tax cuts, that number was, that number was down, and after the capital gains tax cut of '97, which I think is absolutely crucial, I'll come back to that. By that point, it was down to about 16% effective tax rate. So that's a fairly recent history. So these tax cuts have made a big difference. They're worth several $100 million for every taxpayer in the top 400. And if you look at going forward, extending the Bush tax cuts or doing additional cuts, tax cuts such as those proposed in the Ryan plan, you're talking about very, very, very large amounts for millionaires. Something on the order of $300,000 to $500,000 in additional tax cuts for each millionaire household. So that's, I think, it's amid all of the discussion of how you would change the market incentives, I think it's worth noting that the federal government has massively enriched those at the top, and the evidence that that's financially or economically beneficial is very, very thin. Second thing I would say is that on the CEO side, here I think it's really we can't expect unions to play the counterweight role they once did, but shareholders cannot. It's clear in the current context play that role. Boards are obviously quite compliant. There's ample evidence of that. A lot of pay is camouflaged from shareholders as well, but shareholders just don't have very effective voice, and they're not, as an atomized kind of individual shareholder model, they're not going to be able to push back. And it's actually interesting that the say-on-pay provisions in Dodd-Frank have actually caused some shareholder activism. But note that even when the Citigroup pay package was rejected by shareholders in what was considered a stinging rebuke, it was completely advisory, right? And everyone knows they're going to come back and they're going to have something that's better packaged and slightly more modest, but still grossly exorbitant. So I think that's the right direction to go. There are models from other countries. There are also I think there's a normative point, which is that at those who are advising companies, those who are involved in business press and in discussing companies, have to point out just how distorted the compensation packages often are, right? So that has to be a new standard. So last thing I'll say, I know I'm going on CEOs, but they're something of an obsession of mine. The last thing I would say is that on the finance side, if you look at the pattern of finance compensation, how it's changed, it really does track quite closely the deregulation of finance. And so the challenge is, there is positive financial innovation, right? We see the Silicon Valley entrepreneurship model that was founded through new forms of venture capital, and you want to allow that to happen. But I think we've just discovered that allowing banking and basically equity investing to commingle was a huge mistake. But we still have these exotic shores of the finance world where people are making very large rewards, but where they are also bearing a lot of that risk, and the economy as a whole is not at risk of cracking up if they make big mistakes.
So, Jacob, you've given us some very, I think, compelling policy oriented ways to change the game. Going to the campaign finance side, Joe, you talked about being intrigued by Eliot Spitzer and his views on this, and I guess this would not be the first time where issue on which he probably agrees with the ACLU.
Right.
His equation of campaign contributions and free speech, do you find this a constitutionally compelling argument? And whether, the second part of the question is, do you see any plausible route with the current composition of the electorate and/or legislature to have a constitutional amendment that would overturn the Free Speech Now decision, which was actually the one after Citizens United, which opened things up for super PACs?
Do I see a route to that? I think not in this election cycle. Mm-hmm. And
does it have to get worse? Do we need to see more egregious,
Well, I think that if you see Barack Obama reelected, and that helps other Democrats get elected, and they're the ones who are going to do it if it's going to get done, right? But let me just back up for a second on all of these issues. I think one thing that's this conversation is naturally gloomy and depressing, and that's maybe as it should be. However, everything we're talking about is exactly what this election is about, I mean, it's exactly the discussion that we're having. Do we want to be in a world in which it's free-range super capitalism, and we'll just sort of see how it all shakes out? You know, or do we want, you know, some sort of, you know, more regulations, more thoughts to, you know, keeping a level playing field in the country? So to me, I mean, if there's any sort of optimism to this, it's that we are discussing this. And despite all the money flying all over the place, I've been reading about it. I've been seeing it everywhere. People are talking about it all the time. I mean, I'm kind of amazed, like, it's because of the economic situation we're in, but the fact that we're having a conversation about capitalism is kind of amazing. I mean, it's like, you imagine having this conversation 8 years ago, you would never have, like, been thinking about, you know, this. So the fact that we have arrived to a moment where we are questioning the influence of money, and it's happening in the mainstream media. It's not like you can't see it on, you know, talked about in either negatively or positively on your TV screen and in the newspaper. So the fact that that's happening is that actually sets up the possibility for constituencies, for politicians to hear that, to people to run on that. You know, I mean, that's, and you know, whether that will happen, it's not going to happen in this election cycle, but it could happen after. And by the way, one last thing, the reason I said this is a case study, this election, I mean, it's sad that we have to make our whole presidential election the case study that will determine whether our democracy is about to melt down. But at the same time, after this election, we will see the results of what we have wrought here. So, and if people are, you know, horrified, you will see, hopefully, some sort of response to that in the political realm. So.
Okay. I'm going to reserve the right, since I have tons more questions, to ask one or two more, but first I want to open it up to the audience to see if anyone has questions, and you are first, young lady.
So I suggest everybody look at the words on the sign behind these two individuals, and think back to 1971, and there are plenty of you in the room who've been here and done this. Well, it's never been quite so bad as it is right now, but those of us who lived and worked, thank you, through the 60s, we fought a fight before, but not one that feels as unwinnable as now. There's one party. Forget about Democrats and Republicans. A little bit more here, a little bit less there. It doesn't really matter. You get elected, you're sucked into a sick, I don't want to use the word broken. It's just, it's functioning very well for the ones it's functioning for. But you've got the electeds, you've got the high earners, and then you have the handmaidens or whoremongers, if you want to call them, the consultants slash lobbyists who enable all of this. How can any change take place when you're facing that tsunami of money? They're not going to allow the rollback to anything prior to making all that money, all of them. How do we as citizens, united, one would hope, make any kind of change in this system? We agree with everything you say. That's the baseline starting point. You don't have to convince us. I saw you on Bill Moyers. I read your book. I've been reading Gretchen Morgenson every Sunday. Everybody else here, I imagine, as well. I'm finally, at this point in my life, I say, I don't know what to do. I sent money to Elizabeth Warren, but I'm not convinced that if she gets elected, she's not going to turn into the rest of them. Thank you. I'd really like to hear what you guys have to say.
Oh, you want me to answer that question? I was like, why don't we just take a few more?
Claim all this wisdom at the tender age of 41. I would ask you to try and help us out here with something that is not just describing the problem, we get it. What do we do? How do we do it? You're in a room full of people who clearly would like to, I would imagine, and clueless.
Well, so that is a tough question, and I must admit that I'm glad you read the book. I think a lot of people who have read the book, and there are not a lot of people who've read the book, but those who have,
have come away from the final chapter somewhat disappointed because at the end of describing this 30-year war, as we call it, we offer up some ideas, but they are perhaps not as inspiring as we would want. And so let me just say a little bit about how I see the problem and why, like Joe, I am glad that we're discussing these, but maybe somewhat less optimistic that itself is enough. But I'll try not to harp on the pessimism. So as I see it, the fundamental problem is really not rooted in campaigns or campaign finance, but in organization and organizational imbalances in American society, particularly between basically those who've done very well over the last generation and the most deep-pocketed corporate interests and ordinary Americans who have not done as well. And I think money has played a very important role in this, but I think it really stems from this organizational imbalance. And if you think about times in our history when we have faced that before, and the one that comes to mind most vividly to me is the progressive era, but I think also in different ways the challenges and struggles of the 1930s and 1960s also resonate with this. It has been broad-based civic organization that has changed the balance, not by itself. I mean, I think it's a very big mistake to think that social movements, new organizational forms, which have, in the case of the suffrage movement, in the case of the progressive movement, in the case of the civil rights movement, have often been empowered by new technologies. By this I don't mean Twitter. By this I mean new ways of organizing, of connecting people. The abolitionists, for example, in the 19th century with the petitions that allowed them to identify who else was sympathetic to them. So I think that is how change has occurred in these challenging moments, and that of course is just to push back the question to how would that occur. And when you look at the progressive era, you look at the civil rights era, a little bit less the Great Depression and the New Deal, which was much more crisis-driven, you see this recurrent pattern of this recurrent connection between elites, sympathetic elites in government primarily, but not always in government, and the grassroots. And those connections, it seems to me, are the most sort of neglected but crucial aspect of large-scale political and social reform, and they seem to me to be where we're lacking. It's not just that you can't get people angry or you can't get them out to protest or to march or to join groups or to contribute money. It's also that there's no one to talk to at the top echelons of American government. There is not no one, but there are very few people to talk to. This is a problem that you described. It's kind of the chicken and egg problem of political reform, or as we described it in the book, the catch-22 of political reform. Lippmann said democracy has to lift itself up by its own bootstraps, and that's precisely the problem. Dysfunctional political system is the only route to fixing a dysfunctional political system. So I do think that one of the virtues, the more I've pondered this, one of the virtues of a focus on money, and in particular on Citizens United, which in some ways was only the last nail in the coffin of reasonable regulation and treatment of campaign finance. Really the coffin itself was Buckley, right?
Yeah.
And it was Buckley's equation of speech and money that really, I think, set us down this baleful course. And so Larry Lessig is convinced. He's got one very powerful note. But I'm increasingly believe that for organizing, that may be what's necessary. However, when you look, and sorry to throw in the however, this is where the pessimism comes back. When you look at where younger Americans in particular place their concerns, they're deeply cynical about politics and worried about money. But really, their main concern, and rightly so, is that their economic future is being lost before them. Right? We are losing a generation. In the way that we've been losing the American dream. That's most manifest, I think, among younger Americans. And so I think that then the inspiration has to come from a two-pronged, basically, organizing effort. One prong is about reclaiming an economy that works for a broad majority of Americans, and the other is about fixing campaign finance, fixing the distortion of American politics by money. And on the former, that is on talking about economic reform, I believe that that here again, there is much too much focus on the budget and on tax policy, all crucial, and much too little on this fundamental question that's in the minds of most Americans today. Have we lost that race to the future that people talk about? Are we going to have the ability to reclaim the elements of the American economy and society that once made us feel proud and once made us see this promise extending into the future? That's what people are worried about. And unless you say that we need to have an economy that is based on partnership between government and the private sector, that is built on the idea that prosperity comes from the investments in people and in common goods, then you're not going to have that shared prosperity.
Thank you. Sir?
Couple of questions. One is that given that the Citizens United vote was a 5-4 vote, it seems to me that the election is critical because it will determine who the next Supreme Court nominees will be. And so if you flip one vote on the Supreme Court, arguably, you can create a different universe. But one of the things that disturbs me on the left about campaign finance is that, at least in the 70s, there was a push towards public financing of elections. There's no counter that's been offered that I can see towards that. I mean, the response in the Senate to the Citizens United was, let's figure out ways to tweak it and modify it, but not to say, is there another way in which we should really begin to finance elections so as that, yes, it's costly, but let's make it the citizens pay for it and not individuals are able to pay for it based upon their level of wealth. Is there any movement you're seeing towards that? And then the other question I have is that you talked about the Obama administration and its campaign efforts on the internet and funding, but also one of the tenets was really OFA was really about citizens organizing to talk to government. Yeah. And that infrastructure was clearly not kept up during this administration, during the 4 years. It was not tapped during the healthcare debate. It's not been tapped during any other debate where it was informed and then brought back to Congress. Yet we see the right having done that with the Tea Party, right? To some extent, holding those people accountable by basically making sure there's a grassroots nexus in place. Why do you think that didn't happen with OFA? What can be done to make sure that happens if Obama gets a second term?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's hard to think that it would be done more thoroughly in a second term than a first term, because generally, you know, when you have the prospect of running for re-election, you're going to be a little more concerned with keeping your political infrastructure, you know, well greased. And so I think a lot of progressives were particularly disappointed that there wasn't more mobilization both during healthcare reform and the financial reform bill. What are y'all's thoughts?
Well, you know, I'm looking for moments of hope. I'm going to be the guy that tries to come up with a little pocket of hope here, but you know, Obama, if he doesn't have the rich guys looking out for him, he is going to need in this election to get those people, those individual donations working again, get that machine going. He's going to have to motivate the base, and he's going to have to, we would hope, make some promises in that direction, and in a second term, lame duck, have a lot more kind of we would hope a bigger risk taker in terms of listening to his party base and active, you know, mobilizing and doing things that actually executing in a way that he didn't in this first term.
And there did appear to be sort of an inflection point several months ago when he changed from conciliatory
I was going to mention that, yeah,
to the more sort of
right. And it happened as a result. We saw it was obvious because of the Occupy movement. He adopted some of that momentum. He did the Teddy Roosevelt stump speech, and it was about trying to take some of the wind into the sails. So that's, to me, that's, you know, it's happening in a different way, but it's happening, you know, in maybe an indirect way. But.
So maybe the counter argument to the point that I raised about, you know, in a second term, when you're not going to run for re-election, you might be less motivated to keep up your political infrastructure. The counterpoint to that could be that, hey, maybe he really deep down under all these layers is a big liberal. And in a second term, maybe we'll see it when he doesn't ever have to run for re-election.
Well, yeah, especially with his legacy at stake, and you know, one would think that he would that's when you get the chance to be bigger and bolder, right?
So on that point, were either of you surprised? You talked a little bit about the revolving door of government, Jacob, earlier. And you talked about Wall Street, basically Goldman Sachs to the administration, it happening in the Clinton term and then both Bush terms. And now most of the same characters have come back into the Obama administration. What are your thoughts on that? And is there, is there anyone in there right now who you feel is a strong enough counterweight to the sort of prevailing Tim Geithner view of the world?
So I won't answer that question, but I will say something about, because I think it fits in with what we were just discussing. I mean, I think the real question is whether this shift is a kind of more of a rhetorical or sort of donning of campaign garb, and it isn't going to have lasting effects. We should remember why they essentially neutered the organizing and citizen-oriented aspects of the campaign. It was because they were on this nice partisan knife's edge, and they believed that everything had to be done through organized combat within Congress. In fact, there was an incident that may be apocryphal where Emanuel got very upset because some OFA folks were like agitating in some pivotal congressman's district and said, tell them to basically, what Emanuel would say, right? The joke about Emanuel being he chopped off his middle finger, thus rendering himself mute. So he apparently, so that really was sort of that was what led them, that was part of what led them to sort of put it on the back burner. The strategic situation is going to be fundamentally different, right? I mean, most people expect the Republican House. Certainly they don't expect Democratic 60-vote Democratic Senate majority. So, it may be that a president who's sort of swinging for the bleachers or seeking to cement his legacy might be more likely to want to adopt a kind of outside strategy. I think the jury is very much out. On juries and justices, how was that for a segue? This 5-4 point is a good one. And it just reminds us of why, as someone who's worried about the Supreme Court on healthcare reform, why it's so frustrating that Justice Kennedy has the nation's fate in his hands so often. The fact is, though, again, I don't think Citizens United is fundamental. It's changed the situation. As I said, I think it may shift norms. Like this idea of adopting a politician, it seems like there's just a basic norm that's shifted, that really, really rich people are now openly saying, I would just like to bankroll that crazy Republican over there. So that may be the shift, but on the other hand, before Citizens United, there were the 27s, there was an enormous amount of capacity to put money into, unregulated money into politics. I think that just getting Citizens United reversed is not going to by any means fix this underlying problem.
Sir?
Yeah, Joe, you raise a hope, if you will, the hope that somehow the debate has now been joined around these economic issues,
right,
and we can talk about capitalism for the first time. Nobody on the panel has really talked about Occupy Wall Street, which is marching as we speak here, and not only in New York, but in 135 cities, and has helped change the conversation about these issues. But that's not what I wanted to raise. Today, Barack Obama is in Afghanistan, making a deal with Hamid Karzai's kleptocrats in that country. He seems to be running against Osama bin Laden more than against Mitt Romney. And the whole strategy here is, having lost, basically been defeated on the domestic front, both by the banks and on the healthcare front, he can salvage himself as the warrior in chief, sort of repeating the Lyndon Johnson scenario that Robert Caro is writing about now. Yeah. Is it possible that these issues, in fact, will be buried because they touch on class, concerns and struggles, and go back into the patriotically correct posture that Obama seems to be comfortable in, as he works with the military and brags about, his abilities as an assassin. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because it may be that we are under an illusion here that somehow, because we're talking about this, they want to talk about it.
Joe?
Sure. Well, it was the anniversary of the killing of Osama bin Laden, which is why we're talking about it right now. And things are winding down in Afghanistan, whatever that means. Obviously, he will use this as one of his sort of trophies in his campaign. However, I actually think that this whole economic issue, well, we know it's going to be the only conversation between now and the election. It's just that's how it's going to be, because Mitt Romney has this massive money machine that's all about talking about that, and because he thinks that is the issue for him. Now, Obama, that's what we're talking about here is, will things like Occupy and this dialogue, you know, I don't know what you want to call it, like a populist, you know,
Uprising.
Vision of like what's the alternative to what Mitt Romney is saying? What is he? And he's begun to talk about it. Whether he engages that with the vigor and convincing, conversation that is going to turn the tide and make people believe him, that's what we're about to see. I mean, that's what this summer is going to be about. That's what the fall is going to be about. It's going to be about we don't like where we are, and how can we not be here, and how can everybody, how is everybody going to benefit in the future? So, I mean, there's no getting around that conversation. Now, you could say that, he's allowing Mitt Romney to define the conversation, and I think that's fair. The Republicans, because they've actually been on the stage for the last like 4 months. So it's his turn. The ball is in his court, and now we're about to find out what he's going to say, right?
Ma'am?
Thank you. I've heard so much about we're having this conversation. Now, true, I mean, we are here today having this conversation in this relatively little room, and I'm sure there are maybe hundreds of such rooms around the country, but this country is not really having a conversation. Media is bought. At best, we get entertainment. Just look at the primary season just passed. They didn't discuss issues. They just entertained us. It was great fun, but that's all we got. So I haven't heard anything about the media and its role and how it's lacking. If we're going to make change, this country needs to really understand what's happening.
Joe, why are you bought and paid for?
Yeah. Well,
Definitely going to let you build that
I have to
one.
feed my children. Well, first of all, I think the media is a huge part of this. It is the battleground on which all of this is taking place. I mean, all this money is being spent for messaging. It's all about how this message breaks through, and these campaigns and these outside groups are all about trying to manipulate and get their messages into the media and have their side win. Now, let me just say this. I don't agree with you about that. I agree with you to a degree. There's a lot of junk. I would say like most of it is junk. There's a lot of like cruddy conversation on cable news, and there's really decent conversation elsewhere. You can listen to the radio, it's great. On the internet, there's a kind of actual interesting mix of conversation. You can get any kind of conversation you want, really. Any level of conversation. Now the mainstream, whatever you're defining that is, if you only watch Fox, you're just gonna get that, or if you just watch Fox and MSNBC, you'll just get that. But let me just say this. Even on the basest level of Newt Gingrich running like millions of dollars of ads in South Carolina, okay? He ran millions of dollars of ads using a documentary about Bain Capital. And for what it's worth, he's the one that injected into the conversation the idea of vulture capitalism.
And Rick Perry as well.
And Rick Perry, and this idea that like, hey, what this guy did is actually like a cruddy version of capitalism that doesn't do anybody any good. Hey, that's kind of like, I'm kind of shocked that we actually spoke about that at all. So that's, to me, that's, it may have come in the package of Newt Gingrich, which is not ideal, but it did come out,
That's not a conversation. You see, it's not a debate. It's balanced news. It's phony ideas.
Well, it was a debate. I mean,
well, I never heard a debate on it.
what is a debate? Mitt Romney said, well, of course I'm great. And they said, no, you're not, and here's why.
He said, I'm not going to apologize for the fact that I was successful.
Right, all that shit. So, I mean, but the fact is that, that debate's not over. It's going to continue because, and the reason I know this is because of the story I wrote, talking to the Obama campaign, talking to his super PAC, is not as big, they're not that big, but they have all this stuff prepared. They have this gigantic, weapons stash of messages that they're about to drop over the next few months, and it's all about this stuff. It's all about phony baloney Mitt Romney and his cruddy capitalist ways. So it's like it's going to, for what it's worth, and you're going to be sick of it. And you're not going to want to have a debate 3 months from now because you're going to be so disgusted by it all. But I'm just saying, it depends on how you're defining debate, I suppose. But
no, you right there.
You. I know.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
There's been a lot of talk about the campaign finance and things like that. But one of the things, we're living in a country right now that has extremely changing demographics. And we're getting ready to have a minority-majority country. And with that, they're voting democratically. How much of this push for campaign finance and push to put money in to the campaigns for the Republicans is about race, in your opinion?
I would say
I have a job here, so I'm going to let you.
Well, one thing I would say is I would urge everybody, maybe some of you saw it, but my colleague Frank Rich wrote a great piece last week called Sugar Daddies. It was about all of the sort of like rich white guys that are driving the Republican outside machine. And I think he mentioned in there actually sort of an organization funded by the Koch brothers that was trying to do voter reform in like 17 states that was really about kind of making it more difficult for minorities and immigrants and students to vote. So that's definitely going on. And there's definitely, demographically, the Republican Party is, a white male party, so it's kind of right there on the surface, I think. And I think that fear of that demographic change is partly what drives their organization and their efforts. There's a lot of racist undertones and sometimes overtones to the Tea Party movement, which is their base. So I don't think there's a lot of doubt about that, actually.
Yeah, if I could just comment briefly. I'm from Missouri, which was seen as a bellwether state for decades. For really the entire 20th century, we voted for the presidential candidate who won every time except once in the century. And I served in the state Senate and represented a district in inner city St. Louis. And a close Republican friend told me, 15 years ago, high-level Republicans got in a room and decided they were going to isolate Democrats to the inner cities. Because if they could just isolate Democrats to the inner cities, then Democrats would be seen as the minority party, or the party that just basically supported minorities. And I think that's a microcosm of what we've seen throughout the country, particularly in the 2010 election cycle. The focus for Republicans was, let's beat the moderate to conservative Democrats in the suburban and rural areas so that we can make this party, so we can make inner city, representatives the face of the party. The more we can make it Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, we have exoticism, okay? Whether it's, Kenya or, Hawaii or San Francisco, it's not the white guy in the heartland. And I think that there are wise Republicans who have recognized the demographics that provide the foundation for what you're saying. Jeb Bush is out there saying, we can't afford to alienate Latinos with this rhetoric. He was saying that throughout the primary season, and so are some other, I think, Republicans who are looking more at the long view. So I don't know.
Which explains the Marco Rubio obsession on that side, especially among the establishment Republicans who are the ones that have been in the party long enough to watch these demographics change and are certainly trying to react to it.
Sir?
Yeah, this may seem like just a small technical matter, or maybe it's not, but with regard to transparency of money, who it's coming from, maybe you could explain to us what the regulations are on when we get to know, and if we get to know, who's funding who, and if, is it 501c4 reform in terms of transparency might be important. And then on one other technical point, what about redistricting leading to more polarization? Do you see that as a factor that we have to worry about?
Joe, why don't you take the first?
Well, there's actually a Chuck Schumer and another colleague of his have introduced a bill that I think is going through Congress right now that is about making their the Disclosure Act.
The Disclose Bill, yeah.
The Disclose Bill, right. So that probably won't pass this year, but and I would imagine after this election, given how disgusted everybody will probably be by the end of it, that it will have some win in its sails, and what that would do is, and you know, it was supposed to do two things. But the big sort of arrow in it is like we want to be able to show any kind of foreign you know, investment, and that's sort of the, you know, ostensibly the motive behind it, but it's also about just disclosure and transparency in general. So so that is happening. And by the way, I'll just say one of the on the redistricting thing, that's been a big focus of Karl Rove over the last few years, and it was Karl Rove and Ed Gillespie, the former head of the RNC, who dreamed up American Crossroads. And so what they did was, okay, Karl said, I'll do American Crossroads, and you go head the Governors Association and try to like work on this redistricting thing. So they're definitely, this has been a powerful effort, and it's about what you were just saying too, right? And
it's about packing liberals as much as possible into liberal districts, and Democrats try to do it too.
Right. No, this is one of the battlefields here. You know, this is happening on many different fronts, and that's a big one for them. But I don't know if you're going to. At one point, I'll have the chance to talk a little bit about what you can do. But I think this is the moment, maybe, since we're getting there. You know, one thing is just the most obvious is just to be aware of what's going on and not be afraid to look at numbers and what's technically happening. If you go to the Sunlight Foundation has a great website, which I hope that I wrote down. Yes, followtheunlimitedmoney.org, which is just incredibly detailed and beautifully laid out, and you can just see everything. I mean, there it is. It's like it shows you what they spend it on, who's getting the money, where the money is coming from. Every PAC and every nonprofit, you know, all of them are there. And I think, you know, you may think, well, I'm not sure what to do with that. But it's you know, some of you are on Facebook, some of you are on Twitter. You can actually just go to a page and like tweet to your friends that Crossroads just gave, you know, $500,000 to this candidate, and, you know, now you know. Maybe there's some value to that. Another thing is like, I mean, just as an investigative reporter, it's like, it's easy. It's the easiest thing imaginable. I went on there. I said, well, let's look at American Crossroads. It's a tab on there. It shows spending for media, okay? Crossroads, they have their own media thing. They had bought all of these different little media buys from a company called, it was like Upside Films. And I was like, oh, what's Upside Films? So I punched that in. It was very easy, just Google, okay? Upside Films is like owned by a political consultant named Terry Nelson, who was in the Bush administration and was in the McCain campaign, is friends with, you know, the Matt Rhodes, the head of Mitt Romney's campaign. And you just start to see, you know, like, why don't you just, let's make these people into public figures. Make them, you know, show what's going on. Like, don't be afraid to just talk about this. You know, Karl Rove got to power by finding this like incredibly boring thing called tort reform that everybody will go narcoleptic hearing about. But look what it did for him. So you need to be out there and just like Sunlight Foundation, great name. Just bring all this stuff out, talk about it. Don't be afraid to be familiar with this system, because this is the system that you are living with. So to me, that's important. Yeah.
Jacob?
Well, I was going to say two quick things. On the disclosure front, so the interesting thing, if you read Citizens United, and it bears reading, because it defines down basically what you would consider worrisome about campaign finance to the most narrow kind of quid pro quo bribery, and dismisses with a wave of the hand everything else that might possibly tend it. But it does stress, the decision does stress the necessity or the inevitability necessity of disclosure. That's going to be, that's going to be this aspect of this open speech. And although, so one of the notable features is that disclosure is not required, and that's why the Schumer legislation was proposed. However, most of the money is being disclosed, nonetheless. Right. I think that the thing we do, it's that disclosure, having Sunlight Foundation or Open Secrets, having that information, or the FEC's terrible website. I mean, the FEC should really just be put out of its misery. That information, I think, is not going to reach a broad audience. Let's put it that way. I think it's very useful to tweet your friends, but I also think it would be the requirement of sort of basic information about who's funding, and not just like Crossroads, but the individual groups that are funding would make a difference. In fact, at ISPS, the institution that I'm director of, we've done some experimental analyses with control and treatment groups, finding that people seem to be pretty responsive to such information. These are very preliminary, but that they are much more likely to discount messages that they see as representing a sort of special interest. That said, once that becomes clear, every group is going to find some way to define themselves as the Freedom, Truth, Justice Foundation or something like that. On redistricting, sorry to go on, but the real issue here is that the Senate has polarized quite dramatically as well, and that is why political scientists are often skeptical of the idea that redistricting is crucial, since the Senate districts are states and they haven't changed their borders. But I would note that two things. One is the House polarization, particularly after this recent election, has been much greater, so that brings redistricting back as a potential candidate explanation. And second of all, a lot of House members go to serve in the Senate. And in fact, if you start to look at the polarization numbers, it's driven almost entirely by what are often called the Gingrich class. That is, people who came in and served in overlapping periods of Newt Gingrich. And there's a new book coming out from political scientist at the University of Texas, Sean Theriault, where he basically takes this group out, and I can't remember exactly how he defines them, and shows there's been no polarization in the Senate without them. And that's pretty remarkable. So all the polarization has essentially been driven by those who served in the Senate, in the House prior to serving in the Senate. There's no good argument for allowing politicians to pick voters rather than the other way around, so we should figure out how to fix redistricting.
Ma'am?
You mentioned the power of the Koch brothers and Boone Pickens, and then you mentioned earlier the fear of demographic change. Isn't there also a fear among the Koch brothers for the fear of the limitations of our fossil fuel industry? And this is like their last gasp.
No pun intended.
And this is fighting the young people who are worried about their water and a future and decent air and health concerns. Do you want to comment or?
There's no doubt in my mind that is actually, what's driving a lot of. In fact, the base of money that Karl Rove began with was the oil industry in Texas, because that is, he's the tip of the spear in this, and the energy industry for him is the wind in his sails. And their motives are pretty clear. So this is all part of a broader push for business deregulation. So, did you have something you want to say about that? Yeah.
So I'm going to close with a final question here. We've been operating and we've been talking under the assumption that this negativity that emanates from these super PACs has deleterious, implications on political discourse, on civic participation, on democracy. And yet, prominent political scientist, a guy named John Geer, at Vanderbilt, has written a book called In Defense of Negativity. And he argues that negative campaign ads actually have more issue content than positive ads. And he looks at a data set of all ads in presidential campaigns for the last 50 years, and it's rather convincing. So my question to you all is, are negative ads really as destructive as the conventional wisdom might lead us to believe?
I have two thoughts on that. One is every ad maker I spoke with when I was doing my story, we were all very defensive about this issue, obviously. But because they see it as we're defining for you this person so that you can see, we're giving you information for exactly what you said. The problem, and you know, to be honest, a lot of the negative ads we're seeing, there is some fear of being seen too negative as being the campaigns themselves, and they try to add humor and try to be seeing as less of that dark, grim, you know, lighting, traditional negative ads. But the problem is that the most effective, the ads that get the most attention and that really drive the election, and sometimes are the ones that are on the border of not true. Right. The ones that get a lot of attention, and the way that they consciously do this is they ride the line right next to and possibly over, so that the press will pick it up and it will explode in the media. And this is actually a strategy, right? And in the past, or the last like 20 years, there's been like the media has served as a fact-checking arm. And there are great fact-checking online organizations, factcheck.org, PolitiFact, and on and on and on. But that sort of system in the media of checking for false claims and smears and so forth is breaking down. And because of this sort of the fragmentation of the media, and because of the speed of the media, and I get into this in my story and I won't bore you with it, but the fact is that the ability to make a first impression that is negative and possibly not true quickly and have it actually snowball before it ever gets fact-checked is very powerful now. I mean, you can really make impressions that are false and have it picked up by the mainstream media for a while, and then by the time they figure out it's not true, it's too late. And that phenomenon is happening at a higher rate of speed right now because of the way the internet and cable works. So that's dangerous, and that's why I go back to this thing about you, citizens, have to kind of be the ones who are doing this. I mean, you have to be not afraid. You know, the tool is in your hands. It's like, you remember that, you know, I wrote very extensively about the right bringing down Dan Rather over his documents. Okay, this was the beginning of an era that we are now in, like it or not. And everybody mostly likes to engage in it. But the fact is, you kind of have to be a part of that system because the media is very slow to do it. So on the one hand, yes, information and negative ads. On the other hand, not always true information. So, and this becomes part of the complexity of our dialogue. Right?
Or maybe just a kernel of truth. I heard one ad about a congressman in North Carolina, and it said, first it talked about his votes, you know, basically supportive of equality for the LGBT population, and then a vote on immigration. And then all of a sudden, it started playing like a mariachi band in the background, and it said, if Brad Miller had his way, America would be nothing but a fiesta for illegal aliens and gays. So it oftentimes starts with that little kernel of truth and then blows it up into something, you know.
I'm sure that wasn't a Saturday Night Live skit. I don't know. That just that sounds like a parody of a negative ad. But so let me suggest another possible negative consequence of negative ads, and I think it holds more generally for the strategies that are attractive to political elites today, particularly on the right, and that is that it feeds you know, a deep well of distrust about American government, and that one of the ways in which to think about is that sort of institutional standing, the high esteem that we once held our elected institutions in is a kind of public good, and every politician has an incentive to run against Congress, to get into Congress, but then they get there and they have to deal with a dysfunctional institution that everyone's bashed. But again, I would say that the consequences of that are much worse for those in the Democratic Party who would like to have government play a more active role than it is for the right. And in fact, Gingrich quite candidly said that his strategy was to sort of tear down Congress and tear down government so that not just he could win particular debates, right, but he could change the tenor in the overall direction of American public policy. So to my mind, it's not so much does an individual negative ad have a bad effect. It's that we're at a point, and we've been talking about it, in which this enormous influx of money is providing, as to use a metaphor that Joe's used in a lot of cases, is sort of wind in the sails of some of the worst aspects of American politics today. So if we can't stop the wind, we at least, I think, have to really seriously think about, well, how can we get control of the tiller and change the direction of our politics?
Well, thank you all for your wonderful questions, and thank you guys. Spectacular.